work our way through the historical books. Remember, we did the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then we moved on to Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Kings, and now 2 Kings. 1st, 2nd Samuel, now 1 Kings, and 2 Kings we're working on now. From compromise to captivity, as we see things go downhill for the nation of Israel. But the thing I have on the top of my notes is this: God keeps His word. Isn't that great? God keeps His word. Seems like a long time since we read the covenant God made with His people in Deuteronomy. Remember, they all said, we'll do it. But God there listed the blessings and the curses. But where the passing of time can fade our memories and erode the promises we make, it has no effect on God. God is always faithful. God is always true to His word. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And He's about to keep a certain promise He had declared to His people through Moses, and we're going to look at that just a little bit there. In Deuteronomy 28, verse 15, it says, "But it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all His commandments and His statutes, which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you." And then He's going to list all those. We're not going to read them all. Then down in verse 36, same chapter, "The Lord will bring you and the king whom you set over you." Isn't it something? This is written before they had kings. God already knew they were going to have kings. And He says there, the Lord, verse 36, "The Lord will bring you and the king whom you set over you to a nation which neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, and you shall become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations where the Lord will drive you." And so He says, if you guys continue down the road of disobedience, guess what? You'll be living in a new territory. You're going to go to a strange land. And they will do that. And it's 2 nations, Assyria and Babylon. And they didn't speak the same language. And they will be taken captive, because God always keeps His word. Down in verse 49 of that same chapter, it says, "The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as an eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand." And He goes down to describe those nations again. God says that I will, and He is going to. By the time we get to the end of 2 Kings, Israel and Judah are now captive. They're now captives and taken out of their land. And their beautiful Jerusalem is destroyed, their temple is torn down, and the goods are taken away to Nebuchadnezzar and his dynasty there. Because of their persistent disobedience, God gave them what they chose: captivity. Captivity. As I shared last time, Bruce Wilkinson and Kenneth Boas said the kingdom is divided in 1 Kings, and the kingdom becomes dissolved in 2 Kings. God's patience is long. Isn't that great? God's patience is long. I think He's been very patient with the United States of America, but I think His patience are coming to an end. Just as He said He would judge sin in Israel, He will judge sin in our nation. And we see some of the same patterns. The sad thing is, what I've learned from history is we don't learn from history. Right? If we look back over, we would see the patterns happening in our nation to its demise that happened to Rome, that happened to Israel, and to many of those other nations. And it's happening here. God's pleading is persistent. God's still got people crying out. He's still got great prophets and men of God crying out, asking people to get saved so God can change their mind, the way this country's heading. But we see that most of the time His pleadings are what? Ignored. Just as the nation of Israel ignored it, the nation that was founded under God, one nation under God, isn't that what it says? One nation under God now doesn't want to be under God's restraints. They're rebelling, and God will judge. God's love can also be severe. Just Shirley responded to something on Facebook to a person who has a distorted view of the Lord. And she said, but don't forget that he will judge sin. This person commented back, Jesus Christ is not a judge. Yes, he is. He is the judge. And one day he will sit on the throne and he will judge everyone. And he will also judge saints and he will judge sinners. And he is the judge. But that's the perverted view we have of God today. We don't want to believe that he is a judge, that he is only a God of love. And Dr. James Dobson used to call discipline in the family tough love. And God is a God of tough love. He says, if you cross that line, guess what? I will spank you. And when you cross that line, guess what you get? You get spanked. And so that's kind of God that we're talking about. And he told them, if you're going to have a king, and if he does these things, you'll be blessed. And if you're going to have a king and he does these things, you'll be cursed. And so that's what's happening. We will get to that in the book of Romans before long. Romans 9, 10, and 11 shows you what God did in the nation of Israel and what he's going to do with the nation of Israel. 9, 10, and 11 there. God's not done with Israel. He's not done with his family. God may discipline you, but he never discards his family. Never. He always has a remnant, and God will use them again in our lives and in the world. And we follow Israel and Judah, as Romans tells us and 1 Corinthians tells us, there are lessons there so that we don't walk down the same path. He's warning us. Don't do the same things they did, because if you do, guess what? I'll spank you just like I did them. And we want to avoid that spiritual disaster. God doesn't want you to walk there. He's trying to explain. He's trying to help you not walk in that path. But we're rebellious. And we don't always listen to what God's saying. And it always gets us what? In trouble. 2 Kings and 1 Kings, like Chronicles, can be kind of hard to follow. It's chock full of names, many of them that are hard to pronounce, places and events, and they're often given in rapid fire. It doesn't spend a lot of time to span a lot of time period. It's helpful to understand that the author of 2 Kings systematically traces the reigning monarchs of Israel and Judah, first by carrying on one nation's history forward, then retracing the same period for the other nation. Remember, Israel now is two nations. Israel to the north, Judah to the south. 2 tribes, 10 tribes. And so he traces one, and then he backsteps and takes that same one up through so that you can see what's going on with both nations. First 10 chapters give prominence to people and events in Israel, the northern kingdom. 11 through 17, he kind of goes back and forth. Israel, Judah, Judah, Israel. And then the last section, he follows Judah. Because why? Because you're going to see the nation of Israel will be no longer in their land. They will be taken captive by Assyria. And then 136 years later, Judah will be taken captive by Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and his armies. And remember, we left, as we get 2 Kings, we look at chapters 1 through 10, the emphasis on Israel, the northern kingdom. Ahab's son, Ahaziah, is now the king. Remember, Ahab was a rascal. And remember, he died. That arrow randomly went into his armor, and he bled to death. And then when they washed it out, the dogs licked it up, just like God says. Well, God also prophesied about his wonderful wife, Jezebel. And we'll see her demise in this book. And matter of fact, hers is more grisly than Ahab's was. She was pretty evil. But also, along with going into 2 Kings, Ahaziah is going to get Elijah. And Elijah was a straight shooter. Remember, Ahab didn't like Elijah real well. And so in chapters 1 and 2, we see Elijah and Ahaziah. It says there in chapter 1, verse 1, Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. Now Ahaziah fell through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and was injured. So he sent messengers and said to them, go inquire of God. No, he doesn't. Go inquire of Baal Zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover from this injury. So he falls through the lattice, he's injured. Instead of going to the Lord, he goes to Baal. Now remember, a whole lot of Baal priests were killed, 450, I believe it was, when Elijah called down fire and all that stuff, and he killed them. And then remember, he ran from Jezebel because she said she was going to make him just like them. And so he instead of going to the Lord, he goes to Baal. And in verse 3, but the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and say to them, is it there because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal Zebub, the god of Ekron? And so always remember this, when you have issues in life, where do you go? To the Lord. If you go to someplace else, it's just like going to Baal, right? Do you not have a God? Is he not your Lord? And so we call upon him, and don't be like them and call upon Baal. He gets a divine rebuke from Elijah. Ahaziah does, and that's covered there in chapter 1. And actually in verse 17, he says this, so Ahaziah died according to the word of the Lord which Elijah had spoken. He wanted to live. God says, guess what? You're going to die. And God's going to take his life from him. And his son, Jehoram, or Joram, Ahaziah's younger brother, succeeded Ahaziah as king of Israel. And that's what it says in verse 7. Because he had no son, Jehoram, his brother, became king in his place in the second year of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And so we're going to go through Kings in chapter 2. Another succession took place. We see Elijah. Chapter 2, verse, it came to pass when the Lord was about to take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind that Elijah went with Elijah from Gilgal. And in chapters 2 through 13, mainly up to chapter 8, we see a lot about Elijah. Not Elijah. But here we get in verse 11, Elijah is going to have something happen that's only happened to one other person up to this time. He's going to leave this earth without dying. Look at verse 11. Then it happened as they continued on and talked that suddenly a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. So the other person that did that was Enoch in Genesis. Enoch walked with God, and he was what? No more. And so now we have Enoch and Elijah taken up. Now that's why some people believe that in Revelation the two witnesses would be Elijah and Enoch, because they never died. And the Bible says that it appointed men what? Once to die. And then the judgment. Also, we see pictured there in Enoch and Elijah going up in the world, and a picture of the rapture. I believe they were raptured out of here, just as we're going to be raptured out of there. And so we see pictures there coming up in future books as we move together ahead in progressive revelation. The mantle of the prophet was passed from Elijah to Elijah, whose ministry is highlighted from here through chapter 8 and all the way to chapter 13, as I have on your outline. God wasted no time in putting Elijah to work. And here's a few highlights. We don't have time to cover it all, but in chapter 4, in verses 1 through 7, we will do a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elijah, saying, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves. So she's in desperate shape. Her sons are going to become slaves because she doesn't have the money to pay for things. So Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil. Now, I think that's important to remember. God's going to take what you have and expand it to meet the needs that you have. And he does that. How he does that, I don't know. He's God. Just have to leave that up to him. Take whatever you have and place it into God's hands. Now, Sarah is gone for a minute, but they're thinking of making some changes in their life. They're looking at getting rid of some stuff and selling their home, and probably move to Kentucky. But guess what they have down there? They just have a travel trailer. Not much. Jody's thinking, how are we going to make it? Sarah's thinking God will provide. There we go. We place it into God's hands. If he doesn't want to sell the house, I guess what? He won't sell the house. And they don't move to Kentucky. That's my prayer. They don't move to Kentucky. But that's not my business, right? That's God's business. That's God's business. I know the Wittendorfs are looking. And, you know, God forbid they would find refuge in another state. Too far away from us. But if that's worse out, that's God's plan. So you take what you have and you place it in God's hand. And you tell him to meet the needs that I have in my life at this time. And he's the one that can expand that and make it work. It says, so then he said, go borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. He says, go out and get all the jars you can find, vessels. It doesn't say exactly what size vessels, but that could be a medium-sized vessel probably. And he said, go get as many as you can. And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons, then pour it into all those vessels and set aside the full ones. Isn't God's going to multiply one vessel and make it into many? And so God can do that, right? God's the only one I know that can take just a little bit and make it go a long ways. Look at the nation of Israel. Shouldn't be surprised. They went for 40 years wearing the same clothes they started out with. And God didn't let them wear out, and he can do that for all of us. I hear those stories, missionary stories, and people that have a vehicle that has a lot of miles on it. And they keep on trusting God to put another mile, another mile, another mile. And so God can do that. And when you so verse 5, so she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Now she was obedient. Remember, she's just living by the light she has. The prophet said what? Go into your house, shut the door, fill the vessels. Be obedient. Be obedient to what God tells you. I'm not for sure exactly why God told her to close the doors or why that was all part of it, but it mentions it twice. So anyhow, now it came to pass when the vessels were full that she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not another vessel. So the oil ceased. God knows when to start, when to stop. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you, your sons, shall live on the rest. Isn't that something? He said, go ahead and pay the debt so your sons won't go into slavery, but God gave you enough. What? You can live on it. God's going to take care of their needs. Remember, God shall supply all of our needs according to his riches in Christ's glory. And we also sometimes want to put wants in there. But you know what? So often he gives us what? Our wants. He gives you your wants. And that's this great God that is so faithful. I love that song. And so we're seeing him work here through Elijah. And then Elijah will ask God to grant a Shunammite's desire for a child. And when the boy later died, he raised him from the dead in verses 8 through 37 of this chapter. He multiplied loaves to feed the people. Verse 42 of chapter 4. Just a couple verses there. And then the man from Baal Shalisha and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley bread and newly ripened grain in his knapsack. And he said, give it to the people that they may eat. But her servant said, what shall I set before 100 men? Remember how Jesus did that? thousands of men, their wives and children, no bread, no fish. Little boy with his lunch. The Lord says, give that to me, and he multiplied it. And when he got done, guess what? They had bread left over. Both times, bread left over. And that's what you see. See, God's the same in the Old Testament as he is in the New Testament. And we want to remember that. God is able to multiply to meet our needs. Also, he will heal a Armenian or Syrian captain, depends on what translation you have, of leprosy. And he was from a slave girl. He finds out about Elijah, so he goes to Elijah. He sends someone there, said, what can I do to get rid of this leprosy? And he said, go to the river in Jerusalem. Naaman wasn't happy about that. He wanted to go to his own river. You know, that's the way it is sometimes. God tells you to do something, but you want your own way. I'm not going there. I'm going to do this my way. Well, that wouldn't work. So he went and did it God's way, and guess what? God cleansed him. And so that was, again, something he did through Elijah. He secured the merciful treatment of Israel's captured enemies. They bring in a bunch of enemies from winning a battle, and they're thinking they'll probably kill them all. And Elijah says, give them food and send them back home. By doing a good deed, you're going to make friends instead of making enemies. And so we see that going through. But true peace, however, never settled into Israel, as chapter 8 shows. And Elijah prophesied that there's going to be a battle between Aram, or Syria, whom they just healed the king, or the captain of the army. And Judah will struggle with Edom. Judah's evil king, Jehoram, married Athaliah, Ahab's daughter. So now we see the two nations kind of merging under a marriage. And after his death, their son Ahaziah, so this is what gets confusing sometimes. We have one Ahaziah, he's dead. Now we get another one by the same name. And he briefly took the throne. In chapter 8, verse 25, we see that this guy, chapter 8, verse 25, says, in the 12th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. So out of this union, we get a son. And Ahab's dynasty, though, as we see in chapters 9 through 10, God prophesied that Jehu not only would die, but his whole family line would be wiped out. And that happens in chapter 9 and verse 10. Remember, whatever God says happens. Whatever God says happens. And chapters 9 and 10 relate the story of Jehu. He was a pastor driver. They say pastors drive crazy. Jehu was known for his crazy driving. When they see him coming, they say, oh, that must be Jehu. I can tell by the way he drives. And he wasn't driving a car. He was driving with horses. So he was crazy. And Elijah will anoint him king of Israel, even though Jehoram, as we read there, Ahab's son, was still on the throne. But God's going to take Jehu and use him to wipe out Ahab's family line. Now, it seems hard to believe sometimes that God would choose a man who doesn't follow him to do his dirty work and to wipe out. But Jehu was God's choice, and not only would he take the throne, but destroy what remained of Ahab's line. You can read about that curse in 1 Kings 21, 20 through 29. And Jehu performed his bloody duty with precision and cunning, and he will assassinate both King Jehoram of Israel and his nephew, King Ahaziah of Judah. By the end of the killing spree, the house of Ahab, including his wife Jezebel, was all but obliterated. Chapter 9, verse 30 tells us a little bit about her demise. She was an evil woman. Remember when Ahab wanted the vineyard that was there by his palace? He was whining and crying and throwing a fit because Nadab wouldn't sell it to him, and so she had him killed. That's the kind of woman she is. She reminds me of someone else, but I won't mention her name. And 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 30, it says this, now when Jehu had come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she put paint on her eyes and adorned her head and looked through a window. Then as Jehu entered at the gate, she said, "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" So she's referring back to Zimri, who killed a master there to take over. And he looked up at the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" So 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him. Then he said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down, and some of her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and he trampled her underfoot. Kind of ugly, isn't it? That's kind of ugly scene. And when he had gone in, he ate and drank. Then he said, "Go now see this accursed woman and bury her, for she was the king's daughter." So they went to bury her, but they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. Guess what? The dogs done took care of the business there. Therefore they came back and told him, and he said, "This is the word of the Lord." See, Jehu even knew what God had said, and he says, "This is exactly what God said." And that always excites me, because when I see God fulfilling his promises, even though it be to the curse side of it, he said, "This is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, on the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel." And it happened just like God said. "And the corpse of Jezebel shall be as refuse on the surface of the field in the plot at Jezreel, so that they shall not say, 'Here lies Jezebel.'" There's no graveside to say, "Here she was." She was evil, and God dealt with her. Now we get a little bit of time there in chapters 11 through 17. Now that Ahab's dynasty was gone, Jezebel's out of the picture, Ahab's gone, his family's gone. Jehu's murdered those, taken them out. And so his daughter Athaliah attempted to preserve that dynasty in Judah by seizing the throne for herself, and she's going to annihilate David's line. And we see that in chapter 11. So now we turn to the line of Judah for just a moment. When Athaliah, chapter 11, verse 1, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal heirs except one. Her sister, not her sister, but Jehoshaphat, these names are fun sometimes. Jehoshaphat, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being murdered. And they hid him and his nurse in the bedroom from Athaliah, so that he was not killed. So Athaliah is going to usurp the throne. She's going to be queen. And she thinks she's wiped out the entire line. But guess what? God had already promised that David's line would be preserved. And so God is going to have Joash. Joash is going to be tucked away for 6 years in the temple while Athaliah rules. And then one day they're going to crown him as king. Her wrath is a lot like Jezebel. The Lord, however, intervened to preserve the line of Judah. Verse 2, but there it says she hid him and his nurse in the bedroom from Athaliah, so that he was not killed. He was kept safe for 6 years, and he will become king at age 7. Verse 12 of that same chapter says, and he brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, and gave him the testimony. They made him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, long live the king. And then verse 16 says, so they seized her. Now Athaliah, verse 13, she hears people celebrating. She said, what's this? She sees that they have made Jotham the rightful heir to the throne, king, and she's hollering, treason, treason. Well, they must have liked her as much as they liked Jezebel. In verse 16, so they seized her, and she went by the way of the horses' entrance into the king's house, and there she was killed. So the queen is now dead, and Joash is now also called Jehoash in chapter 12, verse 1. He's considered a good king, and he will, it says in chapter 12, verse 3, but the high places were not taken away. He became king, and he reigns 40 years, there in verse 1. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. So often you read they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, but this is a good king. He comes in, and he didn't get rid of all the high places, but he comes in, he repairs the temple, which Athaliah, his father, and his grandson had not done. So he, along with Jehoiada the priest, removes Baal worship from Israel. Going to take the Baal worship out. Joash, along with the priest, does that. Then Thomas L. Constable says this: the beginning of Joash's reign marks the commencement of over 100 years of consecutive rule in Judah by good kings. Kings that did that was right. It's the longest stretch of time ever in the history of Israel that they had kings that were 4 of them in a row for 100 years that are good kings. Did that was right in the eyes of the Lord. And that's Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, you know him as Uzziah, and Jotham. And they weren't as good as the other 4 kings, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah, but they provided the longest continuous span of God-honoring kings. And then Joash, of all things, will be assassinated. In verse 21 of chapter 12, it says, for Josacar, the son of Shimeath, and Jehozabad, the son of Shomer, his servant, struck him, so he died, and they buried him with his fathers in the city of David. Then Amaziah, his son, reigned in his place. Before we jump into these ones, because it kind of goes into high gear, we're going to stop there for today as we see so many names. Are you going to remember all the names? No, you're not. You're going to remember some of the good ones, some of the bad ones. But there's principles and things that we'll pick up as we go through the whole thing that I hope we all learn. Always remember, disobedience always brings discipline. Obedience always brings blessing. Our nation has been disobedient. God is going to bring discipline. I think we've faced some of that discipline already. Even maybe COVID-19. Part of his discipline upon this nation. They shake their fist in his face, and sooner or later God will deal with people. I believe we've seen it, 9/11, the hurricanes, the fires. That's what the Bible says, that all those things were going to increase. And so it gives us a thing that we need to live for the Lord, but we also need to be telling people about the Lord, because the days are short. And Jesus said, work while it's light, because those dark days are coming. And we don't want anybody to face those. And we can learn some of the lessons from these kings. And you get a chance to read them, because there's a lot of stuff we don't have time to cover. We'd be here for a long time. We will never get through the Bible. We may not anyhow. I'm kind of thinking we might get raptured out of here before then. And that would be all right with me. We'll leave all this mess for the Antichrist, right? And all those bills, let him pay them.